Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, Mysterious Voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, so I wanted to talk about some interesting poetry that I found. And today's poem is all about Nicaragua. I am referring to 0 Hour by Ernesto Cardenal. For those who don't know, Ernesto Cardenal is a Nicaraguan writer, poet mostly. They've lived between the early 1900s and 2020. Their work was very critical of outside influences in Nicaragua, particularly colonialism and capitalist influences, and they were also critical of the Nicaraguan government, considering themselves a Christian Marxist, which is a bit of an unusual combination, and trying to push for liberation theology and those kinds of things. Being pro-Sandinista at the time, but later being critical of those that followed Sandinista because they served more as dictators than anything else. And so their work kind of focuses on that, and you especially see that in the poem that I'm talking about today. They also won a number of awards and honors for their work. And a lot of people consider them to be pretty influential in not only Nicaraguan poetry, but poetry at large, because they went to India and influenced some poets there as well. So without further ado, let's talk about 0 Hour. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. 0 Hour. Tropical nights in Central America, with moonlit lagoons and volcanoes and lights from presidential palaces, barracks and sad curfew warnings. Often while smoking a cigarette, I've decided that a man should die, says Ubico, smoking a cigarette. In his pink wedding cake palace, Ubico has a head cold. Outside, the people were dispersed with phosphorus bombs. San Salvador laden with night and espionage, with whispers in homes and boarding houses, and screams in police stations. Carias Palace stoned by the people. A window of his office has been smashed, and the police have fired upon the people. And Managua the target of machine guns from the chocolate cookie palace, and steel helmets patrolling the streets. Watchman, what hour is it of the night? Watchman, what hour is it of the night? The campesinos of Honduras used to carry their money in their hats. When the campesinos sowed their seed and the Hondurans were masters of their land, when there was money and there were no foreign loans or taxes from J.P. Morgan and Company, and the fruit company wasn't competing with the little dirt farmer. But the United Fruit Company arrived with its subsidiaries, the Tela Railroad Company and the Trujillo Railroad Company, allied with the Cuamel Fruit Company and Vaquero Brothers and Company, later Standard Fruit and Steamship Company, of the Standard Fruit and Steamship Corporation, the United Fruit Company, with its revolutions for the acquisition of concessions and exemptions of millions in import duties and export duties, revisions of old concessions and grants for new exploitations, violations of contracts, violations of the Constitution. And all the conditions are dictated by the company, with liabilities in case of confiscation, liabilities of the nation, not of the company. And the conditions composed by the latter, the company, for the return of the plantations to the nation, given free by the nation to the company, at the end of 99 years. And all the other plantations belonging to any other persons or companies or enterprises, which may be dependent of the contractors, in which this latter has or may have in the future any interest of any kind, will be of consequence, included in the previous terms and conditions, because the company also corrupted prose. The condition was that the company build the railroad, but the company wasn't building it, because in Honduras mules were cheaper than the railroad, and a congressman was cheaper than a mule, as Zimray used to say, even though he continued to enjoy tax exemptions and a grant of 175,000 acres of the company, with the obligation to pay the nation for each mile that he didn't build. But he didn't pay anything to the nation even though he didn't build a single mile. Carias is the dictator who didn't build the greatest number of miles of railroad. And after all, that shitty railroad was of no use to the nation because it was a railroad between two plantations, and not between the cities of Trujillo and Tegucigalpa. They corrupt the pros and they corrupt the Congress. The banana is left to rot on the plantations or to rot in the cars along the railroad tracks, or it's cut overripe so it can be rejected when it reaches the wharf or be thrown into the sea. The bunches of bananas declared bruised or too skinny or withered or green or overripe or diseased, so there'll be no cheap bananas or so as to buy bananas cheap, until there's hunger along the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua. And the farmers are put in jail for not selling at 30 cents, and their bananas are slashed with bayonets, and the Mexican trader steamship sinks with their barges on them, and the strikers are cowed with bullets, and the Nicaraguan congressmen are invited to a garden party. But the black worker has 7 children, and what can you do? You've got to eat, and you've got to accept what they offer to pay, 24 cents a bunch. While the tropical radio subsidiary was cabling Boston, we assume that Boston will give its approval to the payment made to the Nicaraguan congressman of the majority party because of the incalculable benefits that it represents for the company. And from Boston to Galveston by telegraph, and from Galveston by cable and telegraph to Mexico, and from Mexico by cable to San Juan del Sur, and from San Juan del Sur by telegraph to Puerto Limon, and from Puerto Limon by canoe way into the mountains, arrives the order of the United Fruit Company. United is buying no more bananas. And workers are laid off in Puerto Limon, and the little workshops close, nobody can pay his debts, and the bananas rotting in the railroad cars, so there'll be no cheap bananas, and so that there'll be bananas cheap, 19 cents a bunch. The workers got IOUs instead of wages, instead of payments, debts, and the plantations are abandoned, for they're useless now, and given to colonies of unemployed, and the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica with its subsidiaries, the Costa Rica Banana Company, and the Northern Railway Company, and the International Radio Telegraph Company, and the Costa Rica Supply Company are fighting in court against an orphan. The cost of derailment is $25 in damages, but it would have cost more to repair the track. And congressmen cheaper than mules, Zimmeré used to say. Sam Zimmeré, the Turkish banana peddler in Mobile, Alabama, who one day took a trip to New Orleans and on the wharf saw United throwing bananas into the sea, and he offered to buy all the fruit to make vinegar. He bought it, and he sold it right there in New Orleans, and United had to give him land in Honduras to get him to break his contract in New Orleans. And that's how Sam Zimmeré appointed residents in Honduras. He provoked border disputes between Guatemala and Honduras, which meant between the United Fruit Company and his company, proclaiming that Honduras, his company, must not lose 1 inch of land not only in the disputed strip, but also in any other zone of Honduras, of his company, not in dispute, while United was defeating the rights of Honduras in its lawsuit with Nicaraguan Lumber Company, until the suit ended because he merged with United, and afterward he sold all his shares to the United, and with the proceed of the sale he bought shares in United, and with the shares he captured the presidency of Boston, together with its employees, the various presidents of Honduras, and he was now the owner of both Honduras and Guatemala. And that was the end of the lawsuit over the exhausted lands that were now of no use either to Guatemala or Honduras. So that was 0 Hour. In terms of analysis, this is a pretty lengthy poem, but the main sort of theme is colonialism. The United Fruit Company, many different fruit companies are coming into Nicaragua, are coming into Honduras, and they're setting up shop, and they're petitioning the congressmen, the corrupt congressmen, corrupt presidents and leaders to basically give them tax breaks and give them land, give them as much money as possible. And the end result is that the people suffer. Bananas are cheap, so the farmers can't sell their own bananas. And if anyone protests, they're shot at by the military. Nobody really benefits from this because there's no railroad being built specifically. The narrator notes, the railroad is going between 2 plantations and people don't have use for that. And despite, people objecting to this, and it just brings in more outsiders, and those outsiders just exploit the land more. And the end result is that sooner or later, those outsiders, those corporations, are controlling the governments, becoming president, and influencing politics more and more. And again, like, the people are left with nothing. They are subject to colonialism, and they are strangers in their own land. This poem comes off very wordy, at times, very prose-like, as the narrator would say. I would argue that that's the point. It's meant to be more of a history lesson, more of a critique of history than anything else, which is Ernesto Cardenal's style. But as he notes, like, this is kind of wordy, and it's because the corporation ruined prose. This poem is wordy because it represents what the corporation is doing to Nicaragua. I'm not saying it's bad on purpose, it's just wordy on purpose. It's trying to capture the full sort of atmosphere of colonialism and how it's slowly taking over. Because the initial part of the poem, you could argue, is traditional poem, but then it gets longer and more wordy and starts using corporate terms, which is a very interesting aspect of this poem. I do like that aspect. It certainly makes it more memorable. So a pretty solid poem that I definitely recommend that you seek out. Anyway, those are my thoughts on 0 Hour by Ernesto Cardenal. Again, a pretty solid poem, one that I definitely recommend that you seek out. I will put a link to it in the description. Go ahead and read it and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Or if you want to say something about my sort of review here, I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this poem. Or this poet if they don't already know, or even Poetry Thursday if they want to contribute. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and colonialism fighting travels. Farewell.